Hello and welcome to class. It's week 3 of Strategic Decision Making for Managers. Again, I'm Dr. Greg Parsons, and we'll be looking at the assignments for week 3. So what about decision making for managers? Some claim that management is really an instinct in it. You operate off gut feelings. So here Bert's boss says the key to success is actually ignoring the people who say it can't be done. And Dilbert asks logically, well, what if those people are right? Oh, they can't be right. Really? Other people are never right? Listen, you have to trust your gut. Dilbert says, well, my gut's telling me that everything you're saying is ridiculous. It also says it wants a sandwich right now. I'd stay, but I'm putting my gut in charge of my decisions. And Wally, just to add his 2 cents, says, my gut sends messages in Morse code, and here comes one now. Well, enough of that type of humor. Let's see what Michael Porter has to say about decision making. This week we're going to be delving into another major force in strategic management. Michael Porter should be a name and a model that's familiar to all of you, I would think, at this stage of your endeavors in business education. His model, I would say, after the SWOT model, is the probably second most commonly used, appears in nearly all management and strategic management textbooks, and has been around for 30 years and has produced countless literature about the model, whether it's good, whether it's not so good, but in spite of how the literature plays out, it's certainly one of the most well-known models that exist regarding strategic management. So Porter's approach, and this came about began during his research on his dissertation when he was at Harvard, came up with the idea that when we look at competition, it's more than simply looking at 2 companies, Walmart versus Target, or Best Buy versus the old Circuit City. So competition is really a broader force, and in fact includes things like the power that the buyers have. So large buyers with significant buying power tend to be able to drive down prices, get better deals out of their suppliers. On the other hand, sometimes suppliers are the only source of a particular material or resource that's needed, and thus they can charge fairly high prices for it. And there's always the threat of new entry if there are low entry barriers and products and services are easy to copy and there's not much of a capital investment to get started. Somebody may always jump into the industry. I use, for my example there, is the lawn service business, which all it takes is a truck and a lawnmower, and you can start your own lawn service business. Then there's the threat of substitution. Something moving in is becoming more price effective or more effective than something else. You might say electric cars are potentially a substitute to gasoline power cars at some point in the future, or Uber is a substitute for taxi drivers. So the idea that Porter introduced, which was based upon existing theory, but he combined it all together in a new way, said that really to understand how a firm needs to compete, they have to understand these forces that affect their particular industry. Okay. Again, this should not be especially new, and much of the reading for this week kind of reintroduces this and provides some additional perspective on this. I would highly recommend that you go into YouTube and look at some of the lectures that Porter has given and some of the interviews, because they add kind of an insight to his thinking beyond simply what we learn from reading a regular textbook about him. So the readings, we'll look at it from several perspectives. One I think is useful, which is a interview that's done by a couple of authors from the Harvard Business Review with him, where he explains where his idea came from and how it's kind of evolved and how it really provides a framework for additional views of international competition. And he's really applied his way of thinking about this issue in many different fields. He's now working in the health industry, services industry, and trying to figure out ways to make it more cost effective. So he's an interesting guy. I met him and worked beside him when I was at Harvard, and I had to admire his work so much that I had to use it in my own work. So the discussion for this week is going to be based upon the 10 articles considering the Porter School of Competitive Advantage, which you'll see is somewhat different than Mintzberg's view of strategy. And of course, we're going to be talking about, so what's similar, where does Porter come off that Mintzberg didn't address, what does Mintzberg talk about and think about what Porter is doing, and kind of again expanding our idea of the various schools of thought in strategic management. But also, in addition to this, I'd like you to start thinking about the future, which for most of you, the next step is going into your concentration classes, and the concentration classes provide the sort of the first stage in thinking about a dissertation. And so early on, I'd like to introduce the idea of, so what's the dissertation process? Many of you may have an idea, but I've developed a kind of a model to explain it so that everybody's kind of working under the same set of assumptions. And all the dissertations start with a stream of literature. Streams of literature are particular articles that are taken out of a larger body of literature, okay? And they then are combined with a second stream of literature. These are synthesized and combined together, and the two streams of literature then turn into the gap and a bridge, which crosses the gap. Now, at this stage, it might be useful to go back to Michael Porter. As I said, he was doing his dissertation at Harvard, and he was taking classes in the business school called business policy classes, and he was taking classes in the economic school in the industrial organization area. And he'll actually discuss this in his interview. So anyway, out of these two bodies of literature, he saw that both of these actually had the same goal. They were trying to develop ways that companies would be more effective competing against each other. But they were using different definitions, they were using different terms, they were using different literature to base their theories on, and they weren't talking to each other. The people in business policy were not studying IO economics, the people in IO economics were not studying business policy. But from his running back and forth across the bridge over the Charles River, Porter was able to see that these things could be combined together. And over the next few years, he synthesized them together and developed his 5 forces theory and developed his generic strategies theory, and eventually turned out hundreds of peer-reviewed journal articles and books describing how this particular process works. But it was all based on the idea of using two independent bodies of literature, pulling out the specific information that he needed to make his point and his bridge, and then taking it from there and using case studies and analysis to be able to show that this was actually a valid way to look at competitive strategy and gaining competitive advantage. And we'll obviously learn more about that in this class. So once you've got your streams of literature and you've synthesized them, you've defined the gap and essentially the bridge that's going to say, I can bring these two together. Okay. Now you've completed the prospectus stage, and you really can't go any further until you've gotten this far and you've convinced your advisor that, yes, I do have two streams of literature. I do know how to synthesize them down to the point where they're well-defined and there are clear terms, and I know the theories that I'm using, and they're narrow enough that I can see specifically what I'm going to do. Okay, I may not be complete, I may not have all the literature, but I'm pretty sure this is the area that's going to work, and this is the gap that I'm going to use. This is the way I'm going to combine them together to come up with a new idea. In the way Porter came up with a new idea that the concepts from IO economics could be synthesized into or integrated into business policy and come up with a new thing called competitive strategy. Okay. Once you reach that stage and get approved, you then get a committee or a panel. Okay, this is more additional faculty members in addition to your primary advisor, who will many times then become the chair of that committee. And then you start working on the research questions and hypotheses and how you're actually going to test out whether your definition of the gap and the bridge actually makes sense. Okay, so this is kind of obviously has to all fit together. You can't do one and not show how it fits to the other, but once you have the bridge and the gap and those have been approved, then coming up with the specific research questions and the testable hypotheses becomes much easier. If you don't have the bridge and the literature streams to go with it, then how could you possibly determine what questions you're going to ask? Unfortunately, many students start with the research question or the business problem and try then desperately to work backwards to find a stream of literature that fits that, and it just doesn't work. So you really have to work from your area of knowledge, which is going to be your concentration, and find the specific areas within that literature that you think there's a potential for doing new work, combining things together. So once you get to your research questions, then you come up with a data collection method, how you're going to get data to prove it. Okay. And you defend your proposal. That's what we call it now. You're at the proposal stage. That would be the first 3 chapters of the dissertation, which would be the introduction, the literature review, and the methodology. You defend that before a committee, or not the committee, but the administration, the faculty, and students in an online or in-person presentation. Once that's passed, then we go and get the data collection method and source approved from the IRB. Anytime you're using human subjects in any way, shape, or form, you need to get approval. Many times the institution that you're looking at has their own IRB, and there needs to be dual approvals from the Kaiser IRB as well as the institution's IRB. Once that's gained, then you actually start collecting the data, whether it's distributing surveys, starting experiments, going into observation. Then you analyze the data using statistical packages of some sort, report your findings in a statistical manner, how the hypotheses were proven or rejected, and then finally summarize it and write up the results and conclusions in English and show how they represent a advancement in the field, contributed to the knowledge in the field, as well as how it might apply to real-world business problems. So that's the process. And of course, what we're trying to do in this class is begin the process of how do you find a stream of literature? How do you understand a body of literature and the various schools of thought within that body of literature? And how do you pull out particular things that might actually turn into something that would be a researchable type of dissertation project? Okay. So I just wanted to lay this out early so that when we start talking about the different phases as we're going through this, that you kind of understand, well, and I've said this before, everything you're doing is related to doing your dissertation. There's nothing that I do in my classes that isn't going to be necessary for you to be able to do in your dissertation. So learning to read the literature, learning to look at the different points of view, learning to synthesize it, learning to write about it, all those things are essential to being able to do this particular process. At the end of everything, your committee will say you're done, and then you've got to do again a final defense, which would be a presentation either online or in person to administration, faculty, and interested students. Okay, so that's enough of that. You'll see more of this later as I start to dive into the various parts. Of course, when we look at the streams of literature, that involves synthesis. And I think I've shown the Bloom's taxonomy before, but I would just like to show you how it differs from simply describing something. Okay, when we start out in undergraduate school or in high school and we're trying to learn things and we're trying to show our teacher that we learn things, we try to demonstrate that we have knowledge and we're remembering things. In a way, we simply, re-describe them, that you get the right answer on the test to a question. So that's a fairly low level. It's important. You have to do that first. But then comprehension is a higher level of learning where you can demonstrate a deeper understanding. You can summarize things. You can begin to discuss them as we do in our discussion posts. So we're simply not describing what we read. We're now trying to discuss what we read, which is, again, a more in-depth and demonstrates a deeper level of understanding. Then we move up to the application level where you can see how it applies either to other literatures or to maybe work environments or situations you're familiar with. Then we work up to analysis where we start seeing patterns, and then eventually to synthesis where we're taking two old ideas and putting them together, kind of like cooking. You have a whole kitchen full of different components, different things, ingredients that you could use, and you've decided you're going to come up with something new by putting different ingredients together that have never been done before. So that's one of the aspects of creativity. You're not out there growing new types of wheat, or you're not, growing new types of potatoes or raising new types of cattle. You're taking what's available, but you're putting it together in new ways. And then finally, the highest level, again, is evaluation, where you start to feel like you can actually say something about these theories rather than, this is what Porter says compared to what Mintzberg says. You might say, I think Mintzberg is the greatest thing ever, and here's the reasons, and I don't think Porter really knows what he's talking about. But generally, you don't do that sort of thing until you've reached the highest level where your comments and observations and opinions actually will carry some weight with people who know what you're talking about. Okay, so this has, again, a somewhat indirect importance to the dissertation process, because by the time you start writing your literature reviews, you've got to be synthesizing. You can't simply be describing what an article is or what a theory is. You have to be synthesizing the main points and combining them together with other main points. So the key to success for week number 3. Well, you'll be getting your paper back sometime this week when I finish grading it, so take a look at that. There'll be comments both in the paper itself as well as on the rubric, as I try to identify things that you did well or things that you could improve on. So pay attention to those, because of course what I'm trying to do is get you to repeat and emphasize the things that you're doing well and try to avoid the things that you're not doing so well or that are missing. So pay attention to that. I would suggest going back to the week 2 video and reviewing the discussion I presented on the rubric itself and what I'm looking for there. Also, in the Start Here section, you'll find the Scholarly Writing Part 2 video useful as you try to improve your writing. One thing I do have to say is almost all cases, regardless of the topic that you're working on, is start working as early as possible. It's very difficult to turn in a quality paper that you just start writing the evening that it's due. So your main ideas and outlines should be done well ahead of time. The research should continue on during the week, and the rough draft should be available at least a day ahead of time so that you can do the final revisions before it goes in. Okay, as I've mentioned before, they say that writing is 10% creativity and 90% revisions, and that all takes time. As you go through the class, you'll have many more resources in terms of your references to use, and I expect to see those showing up. So until next time, leave you with the Cliffs of Dover and the Chariots of Fire, and look forward to the discussion in the papers. Goodbye and good luck.